In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace a power steering rack and pinion on a Honda Accord. You will need a four-wheel alignment when you're done. Of course, if you need any parts, check us out at oneauto.com. Okay friend, let's get started on our replacement of the power steering rack. To do this, you want to make sure that you tie off the steering wheel in the straightforward position. You don't want it at an angle in any way. Let's get this aligned. We'll continue on with tying this off. So once we disconnect the steering shaft down where it connects onto the power steering rack, the steering wheel can't spin and potentially damage the airbag clock spring. To do this, you can do it several ways. I'll just be using some masking tape. Come around the steering wheel. We'll bring it right around this multi-function switch here. We're not trying to damage it in any way. We just want to be able to hold the steering wheel still so we can continue. Now under the hood, we'll be looking for our power steering reservoir. It's important to make sure that you flush the power steering system before you continue. When you do so, make sure you're using the proper manufacturer specified fluid so you're sure there is no contaminants in the system. Once you've done that, we'll go ahead and remove as much of this fluid as possible. Under the dash, we're looking for where the steering shaft comes down and meets with the body of the vehicle. You'll find that you have a plastic protective cover. Use a trim tool to remove that cover. Let's get right behind this area and gently pry it apart. There we are. On this cover, it should have a small slot. You can slide that shaft right out of there and we'll remove that protective cover. With that protective cover out of the way, you have a clear view of the steering shaft and a 10mm pinch bolt that holds the steering shaft to your power steering rack shaft. Let's remove that bolt. It's important to note, you never want to remove this bolt unless you have tied off that steering wheel. We don't want it to spin on us and cause damage to the airbag system. There's our bolt. We'll give it a quick inspection. We can set that aside. Continue on to lifting the steering shaft off of your power steering rack. There's that. We can set this aside for now. Now with that out of the way, we'll continue on to removing this area. You'll find that it's held in place with three 10mm headed mounting nuts. One here, one up top, and one directly over towards the passenger side. Remove all three of those nuts and then remove this plastic area. Now we'll be using a plastic trim tool to carefully pry this apart. You want to be careful not to damage the seal, which is located behind this. Let's get that shaft out of the way for a sec. We'll give this a quick inspection and we can set it aside. Now let's move over to the driver's side of the engine compartment. Just underneath your brake master cylinder, you're going to be able to see your power steering rack. On that power steering rack, you'll find that you have two power steering lines going into it. You'll have a pressure line, which is the forward line. To remove this, you would use a 19 millimeter. The rearward line right there is your return line. For that, you'll be using a 17 millimeter. Before you remove either of those two lines, make sure you have a collection bucket under the area and then clean the area of the power steering rack where those two lines go into. Just use a wire brush if you need to. Just want to try to remove as much of the contaminants from this area as possible so nothing gets inside of the power steering system. Use some compressed air to dry the area. Now we can start removing our two power steering lines. As I had mentioned, we'll be using a 19 millimeter for the forward line, the pressure line. Breaking this line free can be a little bit difficult. If you need to, you can use some penetrant and a crow's foot 19 millimeter. I get some movement from here. Starting to see some fluid come out of this area. At this point, I have the pressure line separated from the power steering rack. Make sure you confirm the condition of your power steering pressure line. Make sure it's reusable. Assuming that looks good, you can set that aside and we'll remove the return line as well. Here's my 17 on this. This one's a little bit difficult to get into. There we are. Safely raise and support the front end of your vehicle so the wheels are off the ground. We'll continue on to removing all 5 of our 19 millimeter lug nuts and then the wheel. With the wheel out of the way, we have a clear view of our outside tie rod end. To remove this from the power steering rack, we're going to continue at the 24 millimeter jam nut. While turning this clockwise to remove it or loosen it from the outer tie rod end, we'll be holding the outer tie rod end still, using a 19 millimeter. Use my 24 right here, my 19 millimeter wrench. There we go. I've got the jam nut broken free. We can pause on that jam nut and make our way to the outer nut, which holds the outer tie rod end to your steering knuckle. Commonly on the outer tie rod end stud, you'll find that you have a locking cotter pin that makes its way through the hole in the tie rod end. Remove that cotter pin and set it aside for recycling. You want to make sure that you replace these with a brand new one. We'll use a 17 millimeter right on the nut here. A quick inspection, we'll set that aside. At this point, you would want to continue on with a tie rod separator, something that can separate the tie rod end from the knuckle. If you don't have the specialty tool, you can also continue on with a hammer. Give the knuckle a couple bonks right along this area. We're being careful not to damage anything else, such as the backing shield for the brakes or anything the like. After that's removed from the knuckle, we'll continue on by turning the outer tie rod end counterclockwise. We're going to be removing it from the power steering rack. To do this, you'll find that it will take several turns, so keep track of that and then write it down someplace. 1, 2, and so on. Give your tie rod end a quick inspection. Now that we've got the tie rod end out of the way, let's continue on to this area right here. You'll find that you have two 14 millimeter headed bolts, and then straight up, you also have a 17 millimeter headed bolt. Let's remove all three of those bolts and this bracket. A quick inspection of the bolts and the bracket, we can set this aside. At this point, make your way over to the other side of the vehicle. Remove the wheel, remove your outer tie rod end, and remove the bracket. Carefully make your way underneath the vehicle. Along the back side of the engine is where you're going to find the rear of your subframe. We have to remove this shield that's in between the subframe, the power steering rack, and the exhaust. You'll find that that's held in place with three 10mm headed mounting bolts. One over towards the driver's side of this, and two over towards the passenger side. I'll start with the hardest one, right behind this shield here. Let's make our way over here. So I got more room over here. Last mounting bolt. Remove the shield from the area. Let's remove that shield. Give it a quick inspection. We can set that aside. Now that we have everything apart on this side, continue on just above that power steering rack. You're going to find along the passenger side here, there's a small bracket that's holding our power steering line in place. Use a 10mm to remove the mounting bolt that's holding this in place. There's that bolt, a quick inspection. Set that aside. Confirm that this is separated. Now, just behind that line, you're going to find that you have another power steering hose. That hose will be held in place with a plastic connector. Now, you can either disconnect the connector or just lift this plastic piece up and out of the metal bracket. To get that up and out, you can use an 8mm socket. Slide it right up down along the bottom over each of those four ears. That'll apply the pressure on each of them, and then you can lift this up and out of the bracket. Once you have, go ahead and set that aside. While we're still in this area, we're going to start removing this bracket. You'll find that you have two 14mm headed bolts holding it in place. One along the forward aspect of the bracket, and then one just behind it. Let's remove the pair, then the bracket. There's that bolt. There's the other one. We'll reach in here and separate this bracket from the power steering rack. Making our way back up into the engine compartment, we're going to be looking for the three mounting bolts that are holding the power steering rack to the subframe along the driver's side. For the rearward bolt, we'll be using a 17mm. Along the top of this engine compartment, we have clear access to be able to remove this. Reach down in here, we can take hold of that. A quick inspection of the mounting hardware as we continue. Now we can move ahead and we'll do the forward bolt using our 17mm as well. The next thing we'll do is remove the 14mm bolt, which is located just next to it. You can do that from up here or through that driver's side wheel well, whichever works best for you. Let's get that bolt and bracket out of here. Just a quick inspection on those. Those look good. Now let's carefully make our way under the vehicle. We'll be looking for where the subframe connects to the body of the vehicle. You're going to find that you have 2 bolts on each side of the subframe holding this in place. Before we remove any of the bolts, it's important to make sure that you add some support along the back side of the subframe. Use a jack so you can raise or lower this as needed. Now we'll continue on to all 4 of those mounting bolts, removing the brackets as well. Let's do the same on the other side of the vehicle. After completing the other side, we can carefully start lowering the rear of the subframe down. Now let's make our way inside the driver's side wheel well. Take hold of the power steering rack and carefully pull it forward. Once you've done so, we're going to look up inside this area. We're looking for the rubber protective boot. Go ahead and remove that and set it aside. There's that. With the protective boot out of the way, I'm just going to slide a sleeve over the shaft here so I don't cause any damage while I'm trying to remove this from the vehicle. Now we'll take hold of the rack, we're going to give it a wiggle. At this point, we're going to have to start pulling it out and away from the vehicle and starting to twist to maneuver this out. There it is, friends. With the power steering rack out of the way, let's have a close look at the ends of each of our lines. Wipe them off, give them a close inspection, make sure each one of these fittings are still in good, reusable condition. If anything looks like it's rusted or rotted, it's a good time to go ahead and replace those lines. Ours look fine, so we'll continue. Okay, friends, let's prepare our brand new power steering rack for installation. The first thing we'll do is loosen each one of these caps. We don't need to fully remove them. We don't want anything to fall inside. Continuing on, what we would want to do is make sure that we center the rack. What I mean by that is we'll make our way to the input shaft. Use some locking pliers. I'm going to try to make sure that I don't grab on the splined area, just on the smooth area here. We'll take this and we'll turn it all the way in one direction. Now we can count this. 1. There's 2 full turns. And at this point we can go approximately 2 3/4 turns. Divide that in half and continue by bringing this to the midway position. Now we'll turn this back approximately 1 1/3 turns. This is our starting position. There's 1. Should be pretty close right there. Let's install our protective cover and get the power steering rack installed in the vehicle. Now that we have that over there, let's continue on having a quick look at our original power steering rack. You should find that you still have a rubber bushing mounted on the passenger side of that. Remove the bushing and put it on your brand new power steering rack. Now we can get this in the vehicle. We'll carefully start putting this power steering rack into position, sliding it through the hole in the center here. As we bring the power steering rack towards the passenger side, make sure you're paying attention along the driver's side here. We want it to fit right up inside the bracket, along this rearward ear. Now let's go ahead and remove the protective sleeve from our power steering input shaft. Continue on to our rubber boot. This will go up and over and then slide onto the power steering rack. You want the small side facing down towards the rack. Should fit right on there. Now let's safely raise the subframe back up into its original position. With it in the fully upright position, we'll continue on with our mounting bracket and our mounting bolts. Take that long bolt, we'll start it in here by hand. You never want to cross thread these in. Align your next mounting bolt hole. We'll start that in. Now that I have this side started in, do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Once you've done both sides, we can continue on to snugging them. After you've snugged your mounting bolts, continue on to torquing them. The larger bolt, which goes through the subframe into the body of the vehicle, will be torqued to 76 foot-pounds. The smaller bolt, that's for the bracket itself, that one's only 69 foot-pounds. Do the same on the other side. Now over on the driver's side, we're going to pause on mounting the steering rack into position. You want to make sure you start in both of those power steering lines. While doing so, we'll remove our plastic covers from the power steering rack. Ensure that nothing falls into that power steering system, which could contaminate it or damage it in some way. Take hold of the line. It's important to make sure you have the rack loose so you can maneuver it around as needed, so you can start these in by hand so you're sure they are not cross-threading into the wrong position. Now that I have one of the lines started in, we'll continue on to doing the other line. Remove this plastic plug. Some fluid coming out of there, that's okay. All right, now that we have both of our lines mounted in, let's continue on mounting the power steering rack to the subframe. Now let's make our way over towards the passenger side wheel well. Looking in this area, you'll remember that we had installed that rubber bushing directly onto the brand new power steering rack. Make sure that that sits properly in the bracket that's on the subframe. Once you're sure you have that in position, continue on with the upper portion of the bracket. Slide this into place. We have our two 14mm headed bolts. Install each of those. This rearward one can be a little bit difficult. There's one. Once you have both of these bottomed out, torque them to 28 foot-pounds. Now we can continue on putting on our line bracket. Just take this, put it right over the rubber mount on that line. Align your mounting bolt hole, start in the bolt, and snug it up. Confirm your line is secured properly. Now we can reattach this clip into our bracket as well. Just line it up and press it in. Listen for a click, give it a tug to make sure it is secured properly. Now let's continue on to putting in our 3 mounting bolts along the driver's side. You remember that the forward bolt also had that bracket. Let's start with the rearward bolt. This one's the hardest to get to. You can do this from down along the bottom or just make your way up inside that engine compartment again. Slide the bolt right on through there. You can maneuver the rack around as needed. Now we are not going to tighten this bolt. You want to make sure you start in all the rest of the mounting hardware before you continue with tightening and of course torquing. Let's get the bracket on there. Now that we have all of them started, we can snug each one of these 3 bolts. Once we've done so, we'll torque them to 43 foot-pounds. Let's get this last one. Now we'll torque each of these to 43 foot-pounds. Now that the rack is completely tight to the subframe, we'll continue on with those 2 power steering lines. For the rearward line, we'll be using a 17 millimeter. The forward line is a 19 millimeter. Okay, so right there's bottomed out with this line. Let's just ensure that it's nice and tight. Now we'll use a 19 millimeter for that forward line. Okay, so this one's bottomed out as well. Once again, we'll make sure it's nice and tight as needed. Double check each one of these 2 connections, and we can make our way out of here. Back under the vehicle, we'll continue on with installing our heat shield. Bring this up in here. Start in our 3 mounting bolts. Right up in this corner up here. Right here for this one. And this next one's directly above it. Snug them up. Now that we have the shield completely in place, make your way over towards the driver's side wheel well. We're going to reinstall our side bracket. On this bracket, you'll find that you have a small ear that protrudes out and along to the side. We want to ensure that the bolt hole and that tab hole align properly while we continue. Get this in position. Continue on with our 17 millimeter headed bolt. Start that in by hand so you're sure it's not cross-threading. Now with that alignment tab in the proper placement and the mounting bolt started, the other 2 mounting holes that are on the subframe should be aligned as well. Once it looks as though everything's lined up as it needs to be, go ahead and tighten this bolt. Now we'll torque this to 33 foot-pounds. Now we can start in our two smaller 14mm headed bolts. Start them in, snug them up, torque those to 36 foot-pounds. Let's continue on with some copper anti-seize right along this threaded area here. Now we can install our outer tie rod end. Let's start this on here. Once you have it on, you're going to want to make sure that you continue turning it the same amount of threads as it took to remove the original. 1, 2, and so on. Make sure you have this facing straight down. You can remove that castle nut if you have that on there. Let's continue on to putting this inside the steering knuckle. You can turn this as needed. There we are. Install your castle nut along the bottom. We'll snug that and then torque it to 32 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, the next thing you want to pay attention to is the slots that are on the mounting nut and the hole that goes through the stud of the outer tie rod end. You want to make sure that those are aligned. We have to put a cotter pin through here. If for some reason it's not aligned properly, continue tightening that nut until the very next slot is. Slide that right through there. Once you have the cotter pin through the hole, make sure you pin it over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Now we can move along to tightening our jam nut. We'll turn this counterclockwise until it's bottomed out against the outer tie rod end. Once you've done so, hold the outer tie rod end still and continue snugging that mounting nut. Let's just make sure these are nice and tight. Now we can get the wheel up on here. We'll start on all 5 of our lug nuts and bottom them out. Now that we have everything back together on the driver's side, make your way over towards the passenger side. We're going to make sure that you reinstall the bracket and reinstall the outer tie rod end. Torque everything to manufacturer's specifications as needed. After that, you can put the wheel back on, start on the lug nuts, and we'll get the car back on the ground so we can torque those lug nuts to 80 foot-pounds. With the wheels safely on the ground, we'll torque each of these lug nuts in a crisscross manner. This side's torqued. Go over and do the exact same thing to your other side wheel. Let's make our way back inside the passenger compartment. We'll reinstall this piece here. When you bring this in, you want to ensure that it does make its way behind that carpeting. We want to have a good seal on this, otherwise you will find that you might have moisture inside the passenger compartment. Before we continue on installing this, it's important to have a look inside of this area. You want to make sure that that rubber boot that we had put along the top of the rack is in the proper positioning. Now with that said, we'll make sure that we pull this carpeting back and away, so when we put this plate in, we know we have a good seal up against the firewall of the vehicle. Behind the carpeting. Behind here. Line those mounting bolts. The studs through there. Confirm that the carpeting is not behind this area, then you can continue on with your 3 10mm headed nuts. Now that they're all started, snug them up. This top corner here. Now let's make sure that we re-secure that steering shaft. Take this and bring it down into position right on top of that input shaft for the rack. This should just slide right down. While we're doing so, you want to be extremely careful not to turn the steering wheel. Try to get this aligned with the splines. Press it right down on there. The next thing we need to do is align the hole that's on the steering shaft with the slot that's on the power steering rack. Might have to raise or lower this as needed. We'll install our pinch bolt with some blue thread locker installed on the threads. The torque for this pinch bolt is 21 foot-pounds. Once that's torqued, go ahead and reinstall this protective cover. It has a small slit along the top so you can slide it right on over that steering shaft. Let's slide that slit right over the shaft here. Now, as we continue putting this in the proper position, you want to make sure that this is going over the carpet, essentially holding the carpet up against the firewall of the vehicle. Now we'll press this into position over each one of those studs. The top one can be the hardest one sometimes. There we are. Press it in as far as you can. Once you're done under the dash, continue on to removing the strapping that you had used to hold the steering wheel straight. With that out of the way, let's make our way under the hood. Let's fill up that power steering system. Making sure that you're using the manufacturer's specified fluid, we'll continue adding until we're up to the add lines. You can see right in that reservoir, I'm at the first line, I'll bring it right up to the second line. Now that we have the power steering reservoir filled up to this level, let's carefully raise and support the front of the vehicle, just enough so the wheels are off the ground. Put the key in the on position and turn your steering wheel from one side all the way over to the other. We're going to do this nice and slow. Once we've made it to that side, we'll continue by going back and forth slowly to each of the stop points. While doing so, you will notice that air will make its way out of the system. While we continue this process, we'll also be paying attention to the level of that fluid. Continue topping it off as needed. Now that we've bled the system that way, let's continue on with removing our funnel, reinstalling the power steering reservoir cap. Now we want to get inside the passenger compartment. Start up the vehicle and let it run for approximately 5 seconds and turn it right back off. Make your way back out here and double check that power steering fluid level. Typically, it will get drawn down a little bit. Top it off with that manufacturer's specified fluid, reinstall the cap, and then run the vehicle for a little while longer. While doing so, make sure you check for power steering fluid leaks. Now, once you've run the vehicle, you're sure that the fluid level is up to par, go ahead and close the hood and take your vehicle for a road test. Okay friend, the car's back together. I hope this video helped you. Like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell so you can be kept up with all of our latest content. Thanks for watching.